This color grading workflow evolved from the need to take my S-LOG3 footage and make it feel more cinematic in a way that was quick and repeatable. And so what you're going to learn today is my step-by-step process, things you shouldn't do, things you should do instead, and my mindset behind some of the choices I'm making. That way you can take your S-LOG3 footage and make it feel more cinematic. Before we get into the color grade, we're going to have to change a couple project settings, but they're going to allow us to get better color grades, and it's going to be easier to color grade because some of the tools are going to be a lot easier to use. So we're going to go into our settings, we're going to go to color management, and we're going to put color science DaVinci YRGB, timeline color space DaVinci Y Gamut Intermediate. This is going to give us a wider color space to work with. So that way when we're making color grading decisions on our footage, we're working with the most colors possible and we're not really limiting ourselves to a smaller color profile. And then we're going to output to Rec 709A. If you're using an Apple product, of course, I am, so that's why I'm using Rec 709A. But if you are on a Windows, it's likely Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 or Gamma 2.2. I'd recommend just trying those out and seeing if the colors shift when you send it to your phone or wherever else you're going to be viewing your footage. So I'm going to color grade one shot throughout the tutorial so you can see how the changes and decisions I'm making are stacking up on top of each other, but I'm going to switch to other shots to show you creative ways that you can use each tool that I'm talking about. So now that we're on our color page, let's set up our node tree first and then let's start working our way through it. So by pressing Option S, we can create another node, and we're going to create 6 at first. And then once we get to that 6th node, we're going to hit Option P to create a parallel node. And then from there, we can click on this and go Option S to create another node. And then we'll have 3 on the bottom. The first thing we have to do, like I said, we're using DaVinci Wide Gamut, which gives us a larger color space to work with. But we want to make sure our footage is converted to that color space first so that all the changes we're making are actually accurate to that color space. So we're going to come into our effects, color space transform. We're going to convert this from S-LOG3, S-Gamut 3 Cine, to DaVinci Y Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. And we're just going to label this color space transform in. And if I copy this and bring it down to the 10th node, go to Effects, Swap, and now we want to go to our output color space, which again for me was Rec 709 and Rec 709A, but for you it may be Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4 or Gamma 2.2. Really depends what you're using. And then we can relabel this to color space transform out. And just to get ahead of it and have it on our footage, we can go to Effects here, and we can add a grain, which I always add at the end of all my color grading. And I find the best look to be subtle but yet noticeable texture on the image is 16mm 250D, and then changing the gain strength to about 0.255. I find that's just enough that you can feel it, but it's not overwhelming and it doesn't feel overly fake. Now this first node is going to be our white balance node, and I shared another video on why I white balance before adjusting exposure and contrast. And long story short, what happens is if we're changing contrast and exposure before white balance, we can sometimes bake in a bad white balance. And so I found, and I've shown in the video before, that white balancing first creates a much cleaner white balance. So we're going to label this node balance. And to white balance, we're going to go into our gamma, and we're going to change this to linear. And now that it's in the linear gamma, if I use the temp or tint slider or the gain wheel, it will act as an accurate way to change the white balance, almost as if we're changing it in camera. So you can see that this would warm it, and this would cool it. And I'll just reset that. Now, although the white balance node is first in the image, it's much easier to see what's happening with the white balance once we've adjusted our exposure and our contrast. So if the white balance is in an okay place to begin with, might not be perfect, but if it's okay, as long as it doesn't look like something like this, then I actually like to adjust my exposure and contrast first, then go back to the white balance. So let's do that. Let's go to our exposure node and label this exposure. And because we're in the DaVinci Y Gamut color space, and because we've converted our S-LOG3 footage to that color space, if I go into the HDR wheel and use this global, It's changing the exposure in an accurate way, almost as if we had changed the exposure in camera. I actually exposed this image pretty well, and if anything, I would just brighten it up a little and leave it there. So this was roughly late in the afternoon on an overcast day, but I want this to feel more like it's nighttime. And because it's overcast, it's going to be very easy to fake that with a small exposure change. So if I go into my HDR wheel and I start bringing that down, we can start to make it feel more like this is nighttime, or at least dusk. So about -2 really gets us to that point. And if we want to take it a little bit further, this is starting to feel more like as if it was a night scene. And so this is our before, this is our after, and that's a creative way that we can use exposure. This also allows us to overexpose our image a little and bring down the exposure later so that we end up with less noise in our image. So this is really useful for when we're shooting dark scenes. But it also gives us the option to make creative decisions like this one. Now the image we're color grading today didn't really need a change in white balance because it was set well on the day and I like the way that it looks. So I don't need to make any fixes and I don't need to make any creative choices. But sometimes we do need to fix things or we want to make a creative decision. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So like I said in the last shot, using the exposure wheel, we can start to make things feel like it is a darker time of day. But the problem is it's not really selling the blue hour look that the fairy shot was, because the fairy shot, the white balance that I had set on the day was a little bit more blue. So it felt like blue hour. So we're going to come to our balance node and use the gain wheel to help cool things off and make it feel like it's blue hour. Now, in terms of color temperature, what I like to do is drag things in the direction of the skin tone line. So if I want it to be warmer, I'm moving it towards the skin tone line this way, somewhere in this world right here. And if I want it to be cooler, I'm dragging it somewhere in this world here. I'm not going over here, I'm not going over here, unless I'm making some weird creative choice. So to get that cool look, we're going to go to our gain wheel. We're going to start dragging things down the skin tone line towards this way until we feel happy with our image. And now, as you can see, if I go before and after, this feels like a completely different shot at a completely different time of day. It's giving a completely different mood. And this is how we can use exposure and balance in creative ways to really change our image. Now, when we come over to this next node, we're going to be applying some contrast, because even though this image is looking to be in a nice neutral place, everything looks well in terms of exposure and white balance, we definitely need a little bit more contrast. We want a film-like contrast, and film-like contrast usually has a lot of density to the midtones and to the shadows, and what that means basically is that the image isn't necessarily spread out across the entire graph evenly. The midtones and shadows usually sit lower in the graph than a digital camera would give us, and the highlights sit high where we'd expect. Now here's something you don't want to do. When people are trying to get this dense-looking film-like contrast, what they often do is they go to the exposure node and they start dropping the exposure. And as you can see, the midtones and the shadows do start to feel a lot more dense when we do that. And so we're thinking, geez, this must be the correct way to do things. I'm headed in the right direction. But what's happening is the image is just feeling flat. It's just flat lower in the vector scope. To actually add contrast, we need to bring down those shadows and midtones while keeping the highlights where they're supposed to be. And that's not what's happening here. So I'll bring this back to where I had set it. And if I go over to my contrast node now, what I'm going to do is use the gamma and gain wheel to add a film-like contrast. So if we take the gamma wheel and we start bringing it down, now you can start to see that density I was talking about, right? The midtones and shadows are starting to feel more dense, right? This is after, this was before, after, before, after. Now to combat the highlights coming down as well, we're going to go to the gain wheel and start lifting that up. And I'm going to just bring up my waveform so that you can really see what's happening here. So this is before, this is after, and we can even add a little bit more, and we can drop these midtones down a bit more, and we can bring the gain up a little bit more, midtones down a bit, and this is just a balancing act until we find a place we're happy with. So now if I go before and after, you can see that the midtones and shadows feel like they have more density to them. These levels have dropped in the waveform, and the highlights have remained roughly where they are, or they've been pushed up a little to add contrast. So now that we're on the conversation of being film-like, we're going to add some film-like saturation. And what that looks like is the more saturated it gets, the denser the color gets. So we're going to come into our color space, change this to HSV, go to our channels, turn off channel 1 and channel 3, leaving us with just S being saturation. We're going to label this node saturation so that we know. So now that we're in this mode, if I use the gamma wheel, what's going to happen is I'm going to bring up the saturation of the image, but it's going to impact the less saturated things first, the things that are kind of in the middle of the saturation range. The gain is going to bring up the saturation of everything, but it's going to impact the more saturated things first. So the way I like to think about it is, if you want to bring out more colors that you aren't necessarily seeing saturated in the image, but they're there, then the gamma wheel does that best. But if you want to only increase the colors that you're already seeing in the image, the things that are already really saturated, then the gain wheel is best for that. So in this case, I want to start noticing more of these blues that aren't as saturated as the skin tones and the greens. So I'm going to use this gamma wheel. I'm going to start lifting things up. And as you can see, this is obviously way too saturated right now. And so we would say, well, let's bring this back down maybe to only here. But the problem is, this film-like saturation isn't just about adding saturation. It's about adding the character of film-like saturation. So I don't want to play it easy here. I want this characteristic to be really added to my image. So I'm going to pump in more like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to come to this node here, which is going to be our look node. And we're going to do more things on this later. But what we are going to do is we're going to bring down some of the digital saturation. And we can do that using the saturation slider. I find usually about 35 or 40 is a good place to sit. And this gives us more room to add our film-like saturation. So if I go before and after on this, this is before any film-like saturation, this is after. And by looking at the vector scope, you can see that we're not actually adding saturation necessarily to the skin tones or to the greens or to the yellows, but what we are doing is bringing more density to all of them. You can see the skin tones get darker because they're more saturated, and the greens get darker, and we're bringing in more density and saturation to those less saturated colors, which in this case would be the magentas and the blues. So again, this is before, this is after. So this is much more like film-like saturation. Just for the sake of argument, if I just reset this look node and I was adding a digital saturation, you can see that everything gets saturated and bright. And that's a characteristic of digital that we don't want to have, because we want this to feel a bit more cinematic, a bit more film-like. So I'm going to bring this back down to 35 again, go back to my film-like saturation node, and now we're at a place that I'm happy with. Now once we've reached our parallel nodes, we're going to label these mask 1 and mask 2. And there are two things I like to do with masking, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I do mask 1 and mask 2 all the time. The first thing is to help direct the viewer's attention. So using things like vignettes, I can help draw attention to a certain place in the frame so people aren't confused as to where to look. You know, it's like, this is where I want you to look when you see this image. The second thing I like to do is I like to either adjust or exaggerate the lighting that I saw on the day. And usually what I'm doing is finding whatever direction that the sun or the lighting was coming from and either brightening that up to exaggerate it, or just bringing it down a little bit if it feels a little too intense. So I'm going to go into my power windows here. I'm going to make a circular window. I'm going to make it in the shape of an oval. And I'm just going to soften this out. And because I'm setting my exposure and my contrast and my saturation with my subject in mind, I don't want to add light here, right? I don't want to start adding light to brighten my subject and make it the brightest area in the frame. What I want to do is I want to be subtractive and take light away from the areas around my subject. So I'm going to go to my power window, I'm going to invert the mask, and then if I come over here and I use the gain wheel, it doesn't feel natural because the highlights start to drop a lot, and that's not how it would look on the day. And if you go to the waveform, you can see what's happening there with the highlights. They're really starting to sag in order to darken the image. And if I go to the lift, well, the shadows get crushed extremely fast. And you can see that in the waveform as well. The shadows start to come down really quickly. And the offset does the same thing. It's bringing down everything. And so the highlights are doing that weird thing. The shadows are getting crushed. It just doesn't feel as natural. But using the gamma wheel, it helps leave the highlights and shadows a little bit more untouched and helps bring down the midtones. So it just feels more natural. So if I just start to shave this down a little bit, you really don't need much to start bringing attention to an area in the frame. And then you can start adjusting this to your liking. And I'm happy with this right here. Now in this case, I want to exaggerate the lighting on the day. So as you can see, the light is coming from the right side of the subject, and it's obviously a very hot sun, right? This is sunset. The sun's maybe about this high or this high in the sky, and there's no clouds over here blocking this from hitting him. And so I want that to be exaggerated. So if I go into the power windows, take a circular window, and I bring that up to roughly the direction of the sun, and I just expand this out a little bit. I can use my gamma wheel to help start bringing things up. And as you can see, this now starts to feel a little bit more like a sunny day. So this is before any masking, and this is after. So the after, it just makes such a big difference. We get this feeling of sunlight in the corner, and we also get a little bit more attention to our subject by shaving away some brightness around the edges. Masking is one of those things that I didn't really take so seriously for a long time because it feels so subtle, and good color grading is often subtle. And you're going to realize, though, using these tools, you'll realize that those small changes make a big difference to your images. Now we're going to come down to our look node, and what this is a node that is going to be consistent throughout a scene, maybe an entire project, but usually just a scene. So if I had more shots in this scene, I would apply this look node to all those shots. And there's a reason, because what I want this look node to do is take everything I've done so far and then decide, how do I want to treat greens? How do I want to treat blues? How do I want to treat skin tones? How do I want to treat highlights? How do I want to treat shadows, etc.? So whatever you decide to do with a certain aspect of that color or brightness, it's going to be consistent throughout a scene because this node is going to be placed on those other shots in the scene. So in this scene, what I want is maximum color separation. So I actually want to take a little bit of this yellowy green, start swinging it more towards the green, so then I have this 90-degree angle of colors, which adds a lot more color separation, right? I'll have my skin tones headed this way, I'll have the blues headed this way, and then if I can swing a little bit of this yellow-green over here, then they'll be out this way, and that will be the most that those three colors can be separated. And that just helps the image feel more colorful without needing to add any saturation or adjusting anything else in the image. So if I go to the hue versus hue curve, I'm going to just set up all these points, and then I'm going to put a point on around 289 because I find this is around where the skin tones sit, so I don't want to impact those. I'm going to take this yellowy green area and I'm going to start swinging it towards green. Now the smaller this is, the more awkward an image can become, the more you start to break things. You get these hard lines in the vector scope and so on. So I want these to be big paintbrushes, a lot of people say. You know, we want to use big strokes because that's what keeps our image from breaking. That's what makes our color grade feel believable, because the second we start making micro specific changes, we start to, like I said, either break the image, so like the colors get completely whack, or it just doesn't feel natural. So I'm going to open this up a little bit and let more of these colors swing. And I'm just going to sit them right about here. Now this is after, before, after, before, after. So we have a lot more color separation. Now, because we're living in this world, rather than the yellow-green, this is starting to feel a little bit too saturated. So that's where we can go into our hue versus saturation. And we can, again, protect our skin tone by placing this around 289. And I can just select this color over here and I can start bringing this saturation down. And again, I want to make big changes, use big paint brushes, so I'm going to take this point off by right-clicking so that there's more space. This is a gradual curve. And I'm just going to start bringing this point down until I'm happy. This is before, after, before, after. But this is a creative decision. Once you get to this point, this is really what you want to do with the image. If you want the greens to have more green yellows and have that warm look, then that's what you say on the look node. That is what you say you want greens to do. That's what this look does, is it says, for the context of this scene or this project, here's what I want my greens to do, here's what I want my blues to do, here's what I want my skin tones to do. Now there are a lot of other things that you can do to make things feel film-like, to make them feel more cinematic, but at that point we're creating node trees that look crazy, we're spending hours on a single shot, and oftentimes it's not realistic for what we're doing. And that's why I created something that works for all my S-LOG3 shots. And I've used this on commercials, I've used it on documentaries, I use it on my content, and it gets me to a place where I like my color grade immediately. The only thing I need to change is the white balance if I didn't get it right on the day, and the exposure if I didn't get it right on the day. Everything else works out. I've added all the characteristics we've talked about, film-like contrast, film-like saturation, and I've even added more film-like properties that are more difficult to get on a color grade, like warming the highlights, cooling the shadows, and doing that while maintaining more neutral midtones. And I've added my favorite glow effect, which just gives a little bit of a different contrast to the image, but also adding a little bit of a soft glow. So this is a creative choice. You can turn this on or off. Same thing with the lens effects, which adds a little bit of a blur and a chromatic aberration to the sides. So this was really popularized by the Batman, where they purposefully detuned their lenses to have softer edges. And just by adding this effect, you're getting this optical effect that normally you need to pay a lot for a lens for, but instead you're just applying it directly onto the footage. So I really hope this video helped you out. Try out some of these things and see if it helps your footage. I appreciate you watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.